So here's where we left off, and now we're going to look at how we can get data into this component. But before we do, we'll go ahead and go to our module CSS in the dividend list, and we'll grab the color from the list item and we'll put that on the dividend list container, and I'll just make sure that all of the items receive the dark gray color here. Alright, so let's go to our stock view, and here we have the route that renders the dividend component. Now we need to get the stock that's in the stock view state into the dividend list, and in order to do that we need to change this to a render property, and this needs to be a function that returns the dividend components, and then we are able to put the stock in here, and we should be able to access that inside of our dividend component now. So let's go over to that one, and here we can accept the stock, and we want to plug the dividends into our dividend list. So let's go and say dividends, and we'll grab the dividends from the stock object, and we're also going to need the ticker, so we'll put that in as well. So now if we go to our dividend list and we accept the dividends and the ticker, we can go ahead and log that out. So I'm going to open the DevTools, and here you can see we have the dividends and we have the ticker. Alright, great. Now what we want to do is we want to grab the dividends and we want to use that to populate this list. So let's go ahead and see how we can do that. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a function called render dividend list items, just to make it really explicit, and then we will return, and we'll do object.keys on the dividends, and we'll do map, and then we'll take the key, and for now we'll just console log it, and we'll see what we get in the browser. So we'll call that function inside of our unordered list and hit save. And in our DevTools, we now have the keys of the dividend object. But as you can see, they go from 2015 to 2020, and we want to have it the other way around. So we're going to go back and we're going to put on a reverse here, and then we are going to return one of these list items where the first element will consist of the key and the second element will consist of the dividend list, and then we'll use the key to access the value of the key. So that'll make sure that we get our list items from the dividend list or the dividend object. So let's go ahead and remove all of these list items now. And let's go ahead and see what we have in our browser. And it looks like this worked, and we now are displaying the dividends dynamically. And if we go in our console, you see that we forgot to put a unique key prop on it, and that's what we are going to do now. So let's add a key, and the key will be the ticker and the key. All right. So now we have the list items. Let's start focusing on this trend section. Now we want to determine whether or not the dividends are growing and are consistent. And if you remember, we already did that in the highlights. But if we go and check out the highlights and check out the helpers, then we can see that the function that determines whether or not the dividends are growing is actually returning a highlights object. So in the highlights, we have a component that expects a type and a text. But that doesn't match what we need in the component we're working on now. Now we just want to know whether or not it's growing or not. So we need a function that determines whether or not it's growing and just returns true or false. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab this code and we're going to refactor it a little bit. And then we'll use the refactored function in our dividend list component. So let's go ahead and grab the entire determine growing dividends, and we'll go to our main helpers file in source, and we'll add a new function here, and we'll just call it growing dividends. And this function will still do the bulk of the work, but we won't have any need for the highlights objects. So instead of returning a highlight object, we'll return a boolean. So here we'll return false, and down here we'll return true, and in the end, if it's not true, we'll return false. So let's go ahead and looks like just remove that. All right, so let's go ahead and go back to our highlights helpers, and inside of determine growing dividends, we are going to remove the part that has anything to do with whether or not the dividends are growing, because now we have a new function that takes care of that. So we'll import growing dividends, and then we'll remove this, and we'll remove this and this and all of this, and now we'll say const is growing equals growing dividends, and we'll pass in the dividends, and the growing dividends will be a boolean. So let's go back 1 second. Looks like we were a little bit quick on our trigger finger here. So let's grab this object here and we'll move it into this array down here. And the reason I'm doing that is because we no longer need all of this, which means we're not using the object again, and that means we can just put it in line here. So what we want to say is if the dividends are growing, and we're going to find that out by using our growing dividends function and plug in the dividends. So if they're growing, we still want to return the growing dividends highlights object, and if not, we are just going to return the declining dividends. So that should still work exactly the same, but now we have a function that we can use to get a true false value whether or not the dividends are growing. And we need to do the same thing with consistent dividends. So we'll copy that and we'll put that into our main helpers file, and we'll say consistent dividends, and we're going to remove this here. We're going to return true, and otherwise If it's not true, it's false. But I think we have a little problem when we're going to refactor this function. So let's just refactor it first, and then we're going to see. So let's remove all of the code that has anything to do with calculating whether or not the dividends are consistent. And we'll say is consistent, declaring that variable. And then we'll import the consistent dividends function. And we'll call it here. And we'll pass in the dividends. And now this is a Boolean. But see, here we have a issue. Because we are using the results.size to build up these objects. Or these strings, apologies. So we need to make sure that we still have access to the results inside of this function. So we need to go back to our consistent dividends function in our main helpers file. And what we need to do is we need to return an array with the Boolean and the result. And then inside of the determine consistent dividends, we want to destructure the Boolean and the results from the array that we get back here. And if we go back, then it should still work exactly the same. But now we have two functions that we can use inside of our dividend list. So let's go ahead and work on this section right here. So it's the trends. So basically we want to call a function, and if a trend is growing, we want to return the growing text and the chart icon. Otherwise we want to return the chart down icon and explain that it's declining. So let's go ahead and create a function called get growing trends, and then we'll import the is growing. We'll import growing dividends from the helpers file, and we'll say const is growing equals growing dividends, and we'll pass in the dividends here. And if is growing, then we want to return this here, and we want to wrap that in a fragment. And else we want to return, and we don't need the else, we can just add a return another fragment down here. And now we need to grab the declining icon. So React import React component as chart down icon from assets icons chart line down SVG, and we are going to swap out this icon here, and we will replace the contents here. And we need to change the text. Alright. So now we're going to do the same thing with the piggy bank trend, or the consistent trend. So const get consistent trends, and we'll say trend because it's singular. And what we'll do is we'll say const is consistent, and we'll import and call the consistent dividends function, and make sure that was imported. And then if is consistent, and we need to make sure that we destructure this. So if it's consistent, we want to return a fragment consisting of this. Otherwise, we'll return a fragment consisting of inconsistent, and we'll import class names from class names. And what we'll do is we'll inline here we're going to say class names, and we'll have styles.icon, and we'll have styles, and we'll call this inverted. So we'll go to our module, not the dividend module, but the dividend list, and we'll add a class called inverted, which is going to transform and rotate 180 degrees. So let's go ahead and go back, and we'll add this function here in place of our current icon. So that'll also now be dynamic. So if we go back to our browser now, then you can see that our trends are consistent with the highlights. And if we go back to another stock, say this one, then we have growing and we have consistent highlights, and we have the same trends reflected down here. All right, so the last thing that we need to do is fix this ranking down in the bottom here, and that's something that we'll tackle in the next video. So thanks a lot for tuning in, and I'll see you